something that kind of satisfied me. So all through my career doing that kind of stuff, I'd always had kind of relevant artists at the time, which kept me up from like perception point of view. You know, if it was our sticker on it, people would, even if it was a new artist, they were prepared to listen to it. I mean, they wouldn't always play it, but they'd tell you what they thought of it. So it was a kind of nice gateway into radio, which is why I was doing the commercial stations. And there was a lot of specialist shows in those days, which were playing like good up and coming bands. And then in the mid '90s, I got an opportunity to work with BMG Records, which was Arista at the time. So that got me kind of the Whitney Houstons, the Aretha Franklins, and the Toni Braxtons and stuff. Lisa Stansfield, a lot of female quality singers. And then kind of that morphed into picking up RCA as well, which gave me the whole BMG catalog. So as well as the Arista side and the R&B, we also picked up RCA, which had subsidiary labels like American Recordings, which had Johnny Cash and Danzig, and then David Bowie was with the RCA label then. So it kind of gave me a fairly sizable artist roster to promote. So the company kind of expanded quite a lot to basically, we had a bigger promotion department working out of my office in Manchester than any major label. We probably had 8 or 9 people at one time. And we could kind of do 2 promo tours on the road and have an office open in Manchester. And if I was required at meetings in London. So we were visible in kind of 4 different places, which no record company could kind of ever do. And then that, without mentioning kind of all the artists, but I mean, Bryan Adams and, Styx and Foreigner and a lot of the major, stadium bands at the time, but also kind of, Iggy Pop and Lenny Kravitz and Patti Smith. And, there was some really fabulous stuff at the time that I was proud. I can look back now as an old man and look at kind of a lot of those things that, when you're on the roller coaster and just it's happening, you don't really appreciate it for kind of what it is, but I certainly do now. And then kind of, that kind of rolled on into the turn of the millennium, and it was all kind of changing. There was, with Napster and everything like that, I could kind of see what was coming without, for 1 minute, thinking I was a visionary, but I could see that when BMG went in-house to save money, that it was never going to be like it was. So I kind of did what all my heroes did, which was kind of reinvent myself. There's nothing really more entrepreneurial than emigrating, especially when you kind of no real agenda about what you're going to do, other than you think, well, you know what, I've flown by the seat of my pants all my life. Why should I stop now at 50? So I kind of came out without an agenda. And it was kind of bumbling along for a little bit and then doing things that were kind of paying the rent and working with people that kind of, talk the talk, so to speak. And I was in a position where, I should have been able to suss that out, but I didn't. And of course, it's a completely different climate out here, literally. There's a lot of bands that come out of the UK, which are surrounded by doom and gloom and miserable cities from the 70s that would never come out of here. So I kind of, I originally emigrated to Orlando, and then I made the move over to Tampa. I was doing a little bit of this and a little bit of that, but nothing really spectacular. And I came over here and I kind of, put myself around a bit more and kind of met people and kind of introduced myself, because I got a thing called a Nailing of Extraordinary Ability, which was for services to the music and arts, which got me a green card. I didn't have to kind of apply for a visa. But I chose not to mention that for the first 5 years of being here. And it's kind of like my PhD. It kind of gives you an access all areas pass. And, there's certain people then became a lot more curious about who I was and stuff. And the weird thing about it since then is kind of I've not so much come out of a shell, but I mean, as well as anybody, it was fairly low key. I didn't make a big deal about it, but but a lot of people approached me, certainly over the past kind of 18 months, wanting me to kind of tell my story, which is really interesting because I had a big article on the St. Pete Times and the NBC show Daytime and things like that, which went out to like 137 markets. I got good feedback from it and stuff, and did some speaking gigs and stuff on it, which allowed me to kind of do the kind of putting back. I can like inspire and put back, my experiences. My book, which came out like nearly 5 years ago now, was really lessons learned from rock and roll, which it wasn't about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It was more about kind of the mistakes that people like David Bowie and U2 and people have made along the way, and the opportunities and the risks that were taken. But that in itself is, I always maintain that kind of those messages are a lot easier to listen and hear and understand when they involve famous people. Because those people are kind of like soap stars in a way. They've always been in your life. I mean, if you're mid-30s and beyond, I mean, I see U2 as still kind of, well, I don't really, but, you know, when they were kind of young kids, 19, but you forget they're kind of 35 years in the business now. So for most people around, they've always been famous. But, you know, to tell them when they weren't famous and what went wrong and what went right, I mean, because my story really is about working with people whose records I bought as a kid. And I always maintain that as a grown-up now, if I was kind of in an audience and somebody came onto a stage and started a talk with that line, I'd be kind of glued to their every word, you know, because that is kind of living the American dream. And it certainly doesn't happen to a kid from the north of England, you know. I mean, you know, going to see David Bowie as an 18-year-old and, you know, literally watching him split up the band in front of me. I mean, the band didn't even know on the night, you know, the Spiders from Mars in, you know, the early 70s. And, you know, and then kind of 25 years later, having dinner with him on the road when he's touring and discussing his promotion, you kind of really do understand why he's become the most innovative artist of our time, because he constantly reinvents himself. So that acts as kind of, that's acted as incredibly inspiring for me. So for me to kind of recite stories like that to other people, I mean, you know, I was one of those people that kind of, my job was an extension of my hobby. So if people kind of believe it enough that they can do what they love, the chances are that they can be good at it, but you just have to have, you know, I mean, I said in my book, if you believe it enough, it won't be hard to convince others, you know.
Now, your job throughout the process was as a publicist?
Yeah, a publicist. We call them record pluggers in the UK, because a publicist in England is a press guy, somebody who gets articles written in papers and magazines and stuff. And the pluggers are the people who do radio and TV. But my job was exclusively all radio and television outside of London, because they had a national plug. Because in England we have national stations as well. So we have the BBC that has radios 1 and 2, which are music-led stations. And, you know, network TV shows that come out of London, they're done by an office in London. We did everything outside, even though some of the programs were on the network, on TV, we handled all that. But that, in saying that, that was England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales. It just wasn't just outside London. So it's a pretty sizable area. But it was great, because there were more stations cropping up all the time. And radio was, in England in the 70s, it was kind of the aftermath of pirate radio. So a lot of the stations that started up did have a lot of DJs that were, you know, just playing new, exciting music. And some of the playlists had more adventurous stuff on it than certainly it does now, because it's very much, you know, geared by the advertising now in a big way.
You actually had the opportunity to tour with some very large names, going out there and as part of their promotional team in that process.
Yeah.
You were very young also and learning as you're going along doing this, because I mean, it is what it is, and it also is a thing of the era where everything was still starting to iron itself out, where I guess England, of course, we all know is much older than the United States of America. So there's probably more experience there, you know, than somebody starting here. However, you were still young and you're going through the motions. What, in hindsight now, what would you say was like one of the first thing that comes to mind that impressed you the most and that was a turning point for you that you learned from that experience?
Ooh. Well, I kind of started to learn about how artists kind of think, their mentality, you know, because I mean, basically, without being too, you know, severe on them,